absolutely minuscule when you consider how many people actually lived here from peak to peak. I mean, well, the history of it's not the happiest story I'm about to tell you. You've probably already guessed that. If you go back to the beginning, well, actually, the beginning's pretty much the only happy bit, because under the Romans, the Jews were really just left to their own devices. The Romans, I mean, they weren't happy that they wouldn't conform to the Roman Church. They're a bit too busy, like, torturing and killing Christians to give a crap. So they just said, right, you have your own area, you stick to it, and we'll help you to stick to it, because we're going to build bloody great big gates on it to keep you all in. But you can then have it. Oh, you can build yourselves a synagogue, if you must. But your synagogue, it has to be... Oh, God... You've got to laugh or you'll cry. It's got to be smaller than the smallest Roman church, because we don't want to upset the balance of Judaism to Christianity. Seriously. And then they were kind of let alone, but when the Visigoths came into power, everything goes wrong fast. I mean, the Visigoths, they mercilessly persecuted the Jews. This was relentless. They started by making circumcision illegal. God knows why. Or how you enforce it, but they then made intercourse between Jews and Christians. That was illegal. The children of like mixed marriages between Jews and Christians, they were taken away from their parents, they were baptized, and they were actually brought up in convents, and they said that no Jew is ever allowed to hold any kind of public office, okay? That's the initial mandate. Then they launched something known as the Decree Ethict. In 613 AD, the Visigoths launched the decree, which paraphrasically just says, well, you can conform to Christianity, or you can just be expelled from the province. You've got thousands of Jews who fled up to, it would have been Gaul at the time. You've got thousands going down to North Africa. You actually got as many as about 90,000 who chose to stay in Catalonia and be baptized and conform. But you also have a piece of small print in the decree which no one has read. And it said if you, or any member of your community, like your friends, your family, has found to have relapsed to any piece of Judaism, you are personally responsible to publicly stone or burn that member of your family to death. No one's read this part. I mean, by the time the Visigoths lost power, you've got less than half of the 90,000 left, yeah? And nothing got any better, because the plague began. I'll walk you through the plague in absolutely intimate detail, right down to the microbiology behind it on the Forbidden Tour if you want to come. The brief version of the plague is that, well, it wipes out 2/3 of the population of China, half of India, half of Mesopotamia, over half of the population of Europe. Like, you stack that up, your death toll on the Black Death, where you're just north of 200 million people who were actually killed by it, and the Jews were blamed for it. They're actually blamed for causing the plague, and you sort of think, what the fucking how? But it's logical. No, it's not. It's logical in a medieval dickhead kind of way. You couldn't hold a medical degree in the 14th century unless you hold a master's in theology. Seriously. As a result, the whole of medieval science is just mired in this miasmatic haze of superstition and ignorance. And these guys, the problem being the Jews appeared unaffected by it. They weren't dying in mass numbers. Firstly, because they were segregated quite some distance from the squalor. But the Jews who had conformed, they still kept up one or two of their Jewish habits, like washing, like literally, like washing before meals and prayer. Their levels of hygiene, you could triple that of anywhere else. That's why they appeared unaffected. And then the massacres begin. This just does not get happier. Blimey lively. Enter the Masters of Aries. That's what they called themselves. The Masters of Aries. These are the batshit crazy born-again Orthodox Christian fundamentalists. On St. Valentine's Day, Barcelona, 1349, they hit the city for a 33-day display of self-mutilation, rounded up 4,500 Jews and burnt them at the stake in the center of this city. That was Barcelona, St. Valentine's Day, 1349. People were catching the blood of the Masters of Aries as they strode through the street and rubbing it in their eyes. Everyone believed it had to be miraculous blood, because no one had a way to explain the plague. Like, the church looked guilty. That facade's cracked because the Pope has even moved the papacy at the time. Clement VI, he moved it from Rome to Avignon in France. He's enjoying quite a palatial lifestyle. Meanwhile, millions upon millions of people are dying and no one could figure out why, and nothing else was working, because, like, in a world where your faith is literally your entire life, something like the Black Death, that just shocks it right to the core, and nothing else was working. Prayer, not working. Communion, confession, exaltation's about as useful as Anne Frank's drum kit. So they just blamed witches and Jews, and then they burnt them all. That begins the world's biggest ever recorded witch hunt ever. in recorded history, and the biggest selling novel of the century, which was called the Malleus Maleficarum. Loosely translated, it means the hammer of the heretic. Like, this is a handbook on how you find, question, torture, capture, and kill a witch, a heretic, or more commonly, a Jew. And if you're about 2 decades after the Black Death, your Jewish populations in Europe, Belgium, gone. And I mean gone, wiped out, gone. France was decimated. Here, you're in the ballpark of about 7% of the Jewish population actually remained. And the remaining Jews, oh, they weren't allowed to work. Nah, that's not quite true. No, they weren't allowed to work with their hands. Like, they weren't allowed to be, you know, like blacksmiths, copper beater, bread maker, nothing like it. They had to use their brains just to survive. So they did. They found there were loopholes. Like, the Christians, never in a million years were they going to be trading with the Moors or the Arabs, but the Jews could. So they did. That becomes really lucrative. Within Christian law, no Christian was allowed to lend money to another Christian, but the Jews could. So they did. It's kind of how the Jews became the middlemen. You know, they become the money lenders and the tax collectors. I mean, they basically became the bank. That's where the whole oh man, you know the stereotype. It's prolific even in Shakespeare. The Jewish guy was always painted as the money-lending middleman. That was born out of a need to survive. And the gates that were built to, like, keep everybody in, they just reversed their purpose. They're to keep everybody else out. Because the major wealth, every single province, it all ends up in the Jewish quarter, yeah? Which you'd think it'd be quite a happy kind of ending to the whole thing. It's really not, because, well, it just painted a target on them all over again. On the other side of this is the oldest standing building in the whole of Barcelona. That building was the synagogue Major. The building dates to 200 AD. Like, this is an old-ass building, but they didn't realize that it was the synagogue, good grief, till 1987. I'll explain why when we get around there. It's uniquely tied to the pretty tragic way that the whole story ends. Okay, it's no distance, just around the corner. It's just past Satan's coffee shop. All the places to put it.